today is the use of bowel segments in urology. There is no doubt that this is a very, very favorite procedure in urology. Many people love to do an augmentation, cystoplasty. Uh, Many people have used bowel segments, and but I think we need to be extremely aware of when you want to use it, what are going to be the long-term outcomes of bowel segments in urology. And so I am hoping that this session will throw some insights into the understanding of how the bowel behaves in the urinary tract. And I will also, at the end, briefly touch upon gastrocystoplasty, because for some reason, many people feel that that is the way to go. And at various meetings, I am asked, oh, I think we should do gastrocystoplasty. How about gastrocystoplasty? It's like a wave that came across, and has it gone? Is it still there? So I just want to briefly at the end wind up by telling you some of the facets of gastrocystoplasty. There is no doubt that in surgery we were taught that whenever you join tissues, it should be like to like with nothing in between. Therefore, whenever you do, say, for example, a urethroplasty, an end-to-end anastomosis has the best results when compared to any other substitution in the world. So when you have two tissues which are similar and joined together, they will work. Unfortunately, in the urothelium, we haven't got a substitute yet. Try as people might to get an alternative in terms of tissue engineering, we haven't reached that point where somebody's urinary tract, which has been destroyed by various disease processes, you can put a scaffold of urothelium from the lab, and it will grow and create a bladder. Although there has been a TED talk, and I would recommend you to listen to that TED talk by Anthony Atala on what he has done in terms of getting an alternative tissue engineered bladder. So at the moment, bowel is the only one that we have which is close at hand, accessible, vascular, and can be modified to be included in the urinary tract. I'm not going to tell you various techniques of surgery, etc., in this talk at all. That you can pick up from any textbook of surgery. There is no doubt that the procedure of using bowel segments in urology has been facilitated by the advent of clean intermittent self-catheterization. There is no doubt about it. If there was no way of emptying a bladder which has been augmented by bowel, or a urinary tract which has been augmented by bowel, if we did not have the facility of a CIC, we would be stuck. It's also clearly understood today that the procedure is highly influenced by the choice of the bowel segments that we use, be it stomach, be it jejunum, be it ileum, or be it colon. So each one of these has a role to play in the ultimate analysis of somebody's lifestyle, life story, when bowel segments have been put into the urinary tract. I love this statement actually. Bowel is bowel, therefore it will absorb and it will secrete. And I would like you to remember this mantra every time you put bowel into somebody else's urinary tract. It will absorb and it will secrete. And when you follow up these patients, you must keep remembering what you have done, so you will reap. So bowel will absorb and bowel will secrete over time, throughout the years. As long as this patient is alive and as long as that bowel segment is viable, it will continue to do this. Because every side effect, every problem, every long-term issue is related to only this facet, that the bowel will continue to absorb and will secrete. The factors which influence the type and severity of the metabolic complications arising from bowel segments must be understood. And top of the list is renal function, or the GFR. To my mind, this is the single most important test that needs to be done before you want to put any bowel segment, whatever it is, into the urinary tract, be it stomach, be it blood, be it bowel, small bowel, large bowel, anything. The basic unit, the kidney function, is paramount. Next comes the segment of the bowel used, which segment of bowel, are you using jejunum, are you using stomach, because each one of them will have a different complication or different side effect when you incorporate it into the urinary tract. What is the area of the bowel? What is the amount of bowel substitution that we're going to do without compromising both the urinary tract as well as the GI tract? What is the time of retention of urine in the bowel, in the new segment? Is it going to stay for 12 hours? Is it going to stay for 6 hours? Are you going to keep it for 4 hours? So the retention time in the bladder, the reconstructed bladder with bowel, is again of paramount importance. What is the concentration of solutes in the urine? We know that the urine continues to secrete solutes. Now, added to this will be not only what is coming from the kidney, but now what is coming from the bowel, because the bowel will be secreting also. The bowel will be secreting, the bowel will be absorbing. So what comes in the urine from the kidney will be absorbed by the bowel, goes back into the kidney, comes back again. So this yo-yo, this cycle goes on and on throughout life. If we take a drug, it may get excreted in the urine, it will get absorbed. If you take it in the GI tract, it comes here. So, there are numerous ramifications of this particular facet of bowel in the urinary tract. And last but not least, what is the pH and the osmolality of the fluid content in that bowel? We know that the bowel secretes mucus. We know that the urine is acidic. So what is that milieu inside? It must be actually mayhem inside. In somebody's bladder inside, you can see it, and it's difficult to visualize it. But when patients come to you for follow-up, you can imagine what goes on in that bladder of theirs, and sometimes you wonder as to how well they are and how the body is able to take this huge insult of putting bowel in the urinary tract. One of the things that we need to remember is the absorption of chloride and bicarbonate. This is the most important facet of the incorporation of bowel. And jejunum absorbs both chloride and bicarb in large amounts. So if you put jejunum as a conduit, if you put jejunum as a substitute for a bladder augment, you have to remember this. It gets absorbed, and if your kidneys are not good, this bicarbonate will become an acid, and that will be not excreted because your kidneys are bad. Jejunum and ileum, chloride is absorbed, bicarbonate is excreted in different matter. Stomach, acid is secreted. So each segment of the bowel of the urine of the GI tract produces and does a different function. And when you incorporate that into the urinary tract, you have to remember which segment you have used so that you can identify what are the complications that are likely to ensue. We know that the famous Laplace's law, which actually takes into account the radius of a sphere and what the pressure and volumes are inside that. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this particular slide is that whenever we do an augmentation to increase the bladder capacity, we want to make it like a normal bladder. That means we want to make it a reservoir which will hold urine at a low pressure. That is the basic idea. And bowel, being elastic, will be able to accommodate large volumes of urine if it is fashioned appropriately. At the same time, the amount of bowel segment that I alluded to earlier in the slide is important, because you can't take the whole of the bowel segment and put it inside. You've got to take a reasonable amount, which will continue to allow bowel function to be normal and the urinary tract to also be reasonably normal. So Laplace's law comes into play. Remember that the most common conditions for which we do augmentation cystoplasty is neurovesical dysfunction. The next in our country probably would be tuberculosis. So these are the two most important conditions where we have some form of augmentation. Certainly now neobladders, etc., are coming in, but that also is an important consideration in today's world. But why I'm saying neurogenic bladder is because quite a lot of these people are actually children, and children have many years to go compared to a patient like who's had a neobladder for bladder carcinoma. He's much older. He's likely to have more comorbidities. So longevity for that person compared to a child or to a younger person who has a neurovesical dysfunction and has an augment, the graphs are totally different. The longevity of a patient who is young with a bowel segment in the urinary tract has to be correlated to what is likely to happen as he grows older and older. And remembering that in neurovesical dysfunction, the reason why we do an augmentation is because the bladder is unsafe. You want to make it a safe bladder, and that is why you want to reduce the bladder pressures and make it a reservoir. So Laplace's law very clearly illustrates here. Now in A, as you see on the slide, if I just take a segment of bowel which is 40 centimeters, make it into U, the volume in that will be 270. The radius is only 1.5. Now, if I sleeve it along the anti-mesenteric border and just roll it into a cylinder, as is shown there, then that volume increases to 540. But the same volume, the same thing, if I then fold it and make it into smaller, fold it over again, open it on the anti-mesenteric border, suture it, and then, as the arrow indicates, go from this point to that point and make it into a sphere like this, you see that same centimeter, 40 centimeters of bowel has now produced a volume of 1 liter. So just by configuring the bowel into a sphere, you're reducing the pressure inside and the radius is changed. So this is an important concept, and that is why various types of modelings are done in the bladder as far as we can see. The earliest augmentations did not actually look at this facet at all. People didn't understand it. They just said, okay, the bladder is small and therefore just hitch it on. And that's why when you read the earliest books in urology on augmentation, there was a favorite operation called the cattail anastomosis. In that particular portion, that particular operation, they would take a segment of the sigmoid because that was closest to the bladder. It had a good blood supply and it would reach the bladder very easily. So this had this long tube like this, as you can see in my arrow, and this end would be connected directly joined to the bladder. So it's like a rat tail, and it would be a long tube, but it just have a volume of 270 and nothing more. So it did not actually serve the purpose of making it a low pressure reservoir. And therefore, I think it's important to understand this particular facet whenever you do an augmentation. You're making a low pressure reservoir which needs to be emptied either by the patient, by will, by voiding, volitional voiding, or by self-catheterization. So this is the role and the advent of CIC, which has actually turned the tables completely in favor of using bowel segments in urology. So what are the metabolic complications of urinary diversion? A whole list of them, and I think each one of them is very important. And therefore, when you see a patient post-operatively in the follow-up, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, every one of these complications must be kept in mind. And you have to evaluate the patient for this. Let's take each one of them as it comes. When we take the bowel, the electrolytes, if you use stomach, this is what you're likely to get. You'll get hypokalemia, hypochloremia, and metabolic acidosis. If you use jejunum, now this is a very, very dangerous piece of bowel that can be incorporated in the urinary tract, because there is a syndrome which is actually described as the jejunal conduit syndrome, and people fail to recognize this. I have seen this because what happens is that when the patient comes to the clinic, the follow-up clinic, much later, he comes in the emergency. When you have a jejunal conduit syndrome, you can get such a severe electrolyte imbalance like here. It builds up very slowly and the patient doesn't realize it, but then becomes extreme and comes to the emergency suite. And some person who does not understand what the operation is all about will miss this diagnosis. And you have to understand that the jejunum is a very dangerous piece of bowel that can be used in the urinary tract. So hyponatremia, hypochloremia, hyperkalemia, and acidosis. So remember these electrolyte changes which occur. In the ileum, of course, we have hyperchloremia and acidosis. Just like in the colon, we also have hyperchloremia and acidosis. But if you add uterosigmoidostomy, which is actually a different type of it, where the urinary tract goes directly into the sigmoid and is retained there, not as a segment of bowel, but as its own in continuity, the hyperchloremic acidosis is much more. Hyperchloremia and metabolic acidosis is to the tune of 80%. So these are things that we need to remember when we have bowel being incorporated. Now, these are standard electrolyte changes which happen, and this is related to the absorptive surfaces of each segment of the bowel that is there. The, 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 the colon, for example, has a different absorption for chlorides, more preferential for chlorides. So the chloride gets in and the acid gets in, and therefore you have very high rate of metabolic acidosis. Many people do not actually believe or even consider that the liver is an important organ in the metabolic complications that ensue after an augmentation. Quite a lot of people could have uh, subtle changes in the liver which actually hamper liver function. It is therefore necessary that whenever you're doing an augmentation for a patient, to have some idea of what his liver function is. So it's good to get his liver function test done before. And the reason is very simple, that all the intestinal segments, the venous return goes into the liver through the portal circulation. Now, we have ammonium in the urine which is being excreted. This gets absorbed through the portal circulation, goes to the liver, it gets released from ammonia, NH3, and one hydrogen ion. Now, this ammonia gets incorporated through the ornithine cycle to produce urea. So, if your liver is bad, you will not be able to metabolize that ammonia. Your ornithine cycle will fail. So, the ammonia levels will build up. And that is how you get this so-called ammoniacal breath in a patient with liver disease who's got this problem. And they can go into coma simply because the liver function is bad. So can you imagine a situation where the liver is bad and also the kidney may not be very good? Then whatever ammonia is being produced, a bit of it will get converted to urea, some of it will stay in the circulation. This urea gets into the blood. The urea is not going to be excreted properly by the kidney because the kidney is bad. So it's a double whammy situation. You get both hyperammonemia and you get uremia. So the patient becomes extremely sick. And that is the reason why it is important to have a very good kidney and a very good liver to start with. What happens in the future, one cannot predict. And that is why I say that when you have a patient who is young, the onus, the responsibility on the operating surgeon is tremendous to actually follow these patients right through. Probably how long we don't know, but certainly for a long, long time. Drug metabolism. We don't know how actually drugs get absorbed, many things. And this becomes a serious problem when you're doing a transplant. There are many patients who have had posturethral valves, who had augmentations, they're on immunosuppressive agents. We still don't understand how tacrolimus gets absorbed. And now you got this being excreted in the urine, you got urine stasis there, you have the bowel being taking out, putting the tacrolimus, the other immunosuppressive drugs in the urine, in the bowel segment, into the bladder, they get absorbed. You don't know what the side effects are, you don't know whether there's toxicity. So these are things that need to be kept in mind. And this is why it is very important that when a patient does have an augmented segment, that you tell them to drain it, treat it like a bladder. Treat it like a bladder. The capacity may be a liter. That doesn't mean you hang around for a whole day without emptying it. You must treat it like a normal bladder. You must empty it every 3 hours so that all the side effects of absorption are reduced to the maximum. And this is the genesis or the basis of the so-called overnight drainage, which I believe is a very important tool, and I make it mandatory for patients who have an augmentation that either you keep an alarm clock and wake up or do it, but that's not something that everybody does easily. Just put a catheter in your bladder and let it drain overnight. Take it out the next morning. It doesn't cause you any harm. So as long as the bladder is draining, you will be, your kidneys and your longevity is much better than somebody who's going to hold that urine inside over time. Altered sensorium, there are various deficiencies of various chemicals. You have magnesium deficiency, And as a result of magnesium deficiency, you have neuromuscular weakness, delirium, psychosis, and even death because of cardiac toxicity. So we need to remember that there could be a problem in a patient who comes into the emergency as a result of magnesium deficiency, and therefore that needs to be actually looked at. So if you have a patient who comes in sick with a with bowel segment being incorporated in urinary tract into the emergency room, all these things must be considered. You have to look at his liver function, seeing whether you look at his kidney function, is urea gone up, you look at the electrolytes, you look at magnesium. So all these tests must be done to ensure that you are not missing out on some facet of his internal milieu. Calculus formation. There is no doubt that patients who have had bowel segments incorporated, the incidence of stone disease over time, not immediately, over time, is significant. All types of stones are possible: struvite, oxalate, phosphate, and uric acid stones. The exact etiology is not clear, but is probably multifactorial. The commonest probably would be related to infection, and some people feel it may be an increased excretion of calcium and the inability of the tubule to handle acid properly. So there are various ways by which stone disease can be formed in patients, but there's no doubt, and you would have seen in your own practice or in your own institution, that patients who have come after patients with stone disease have had an ileal conduit done some 20 years back, and these are all difficult cases to do, how to get into the kidney, etc. And the endourology pundits have got excellent ways now of treating these patients. Of course, we also have got shockwaves, which actually revolutionized the treatment initially of patients with stone disease in augmented bowel, especially conduits. I make it a point to actually check B12 in patients. Many people may not know it, but as you grow older, your ability to absorb B12 gets less and less because your acid in the stomach becomes low. Your stomach lining becomes defaulty as you grow older. So B12 absorption does become a problem. Secondarily, B12 comes only from animal proteins. So pure vegetarians, very, very pure vegetarians for life, you will find sometimes that they will come to the clinic with some very subtle neurological complaints. There's some tingling, it may not be diabetes. Just check their B12s. You'll be surprised as to how many times you'll find patients who have got actually B12 deficiency. So when you take the terminal bowel, terminal ileum segment, we know that the B12 is being taken care of in that segment. So we need to remember this facet when they come for follow-up. And what I do is I actually give one dose of B12 before they get discharged, because I know that it will be forgotten. Just give a dose of B12, check their levels, give a dose. If they're fine, they're fine. And if they are low, then these people will require B12 for life. You start off with injections and then later on convert it to tablets, so you can. The other nutritional disturbances is related to bile salt absorption, which takes place because you've taken a large segment of bowel. And secondly, also diarrhea because of some degree of shortness of the bowel, which can occur. And therefore, we have to limit the amount of bowel that we use in the urinary tract. There are sometimes patients who have extensive loss of the ureters due to radiation. All right. And you may have to, and as a result of the radiation, the kidney function is good. But their bladders have become small, the bladders have become dangerous, the ureters have become stenosed because of radiation change. And you will have to now connect large length of bowel between the kidneys, it may be one or both sides, and then augment, and the same thing to augment the bladder. So you've got a large amount of bowel which is going to be sitting in the urinary tract, and that also will shorten the length of the bowel, and these patients can have diarrhea. So these are all nutritional disturbances which take place in these patients. Glucose metabolism. The bowel segment absorbs the glucose. Whatever glucose comes out gets absorbed indirectly and increases the plasma glucose due to reabsorption. So you may find that a patient who has had an augmentation, that his sugars are getting out of control a bit. And if he's a diabetic, then this could be a problem. So you need to be aware that this can actually cause glucose intolerance in patients and actually skew their hemoglobin A1Cs if you're not aware of this fact. I don't know how many people have actually seen bone disease. I have seen bone disease in patients who've had augmentation. Uh, I've seen it in adults, and it was missed by many people. Patients going to orthopedics, going to medicine, going to rheumatology, and they forget the fact that this patient has had a bowel segment incorporated over time, and they have the classical triradiate pelvis, difficulty, painful walking, especially in the weight-bearing bones. So if you take an X-ray and you look at this, you will find that this classical osteomalacia which sets in. And this is as a result of lowered calcium and phosphorus and raised alkaline phosphatase in their blood parameters. So demineralization of the bone takes place. Again, this is all related to acid. Remember, the hydrogen chloride, the hydrogen ion, as it gets released, if the kidney is at fault, it's not able to excrete the acid. The acid loads build up in the system, and acid goes directly into the bone and causes changes with osteoporosis. This becomes osteopenia and then osteomalacia. So, this is a cycle which we need to remember, and these patients need to be warned about it. More important, being warned, they need to be treated upfront, prophylactically. So this is the sequence of events as it takes place. In the bone, you get demineralization, and that leads to both first to osteomalacia or rickets, osteoporosis, and full-blown osteomalacia. So you have to pick it up before they actually become painful. So in the stage of osteopenia and the stage of osteoporosis, you need to pick it up and make sure that they don't become go to the third stage of osteomalacia. Infection. Every patient who undergoes an augmentation cystoplasty, I tell them you are likely to get urinary infection. And this will come and go. There will be some good months and there will be some bad months. In a year, you may get about 1 or 2, sometimes 3 episodes of urinary infection. The important thing is for them to understand that this is as a consequence of the augmentation. It is not the fault of either the surgeon or anybody else. It's just that you don't have any substitute. So you have to treat them. You have to make sure that they don't become pyelonephritis, because the pyelonephritis bit will actually cause a problem. And that's why if you're doing it for somebody who's had neurovesical dysfunction and they had very high grade VUR concomitant as a result of poor compliance, you need to also make sure that you take care of the VUR in those patients, so that if they do get a bacteriuria and a UTI, it doesn't become a pyelonephritis. So you may have to do some form of anti-reflux technique, not in everybody, but in certain situations. A low-grade VUR does not cause a problem. If it's a high-grade VUR with dilated ureters, then you're probably advised to actually reimplant these ureters properly so that the incidence of pyelonephritis becomes less. And what is the reason for this? Again, distension of bowel. This fact of bladder distension and translocation of bacteria was actually told to us by Lapides when his nurse actually discovered that patients can actually do CIC without a problem. They found that patients who did not actually do their CIC on time had a higher rate. And his theory was that when the bladder distends, the blood vessels get compressed because of the bladder distension. And the bladder becomes a bit ischemic. And when there is ischemia, there's translocation of bacteria through the bladder wall. Because as you're doing CIC, you always have a symbiosis. All these patients have some degree of bacteriuria. So there is a symbiosis between the human body and these bacteria. And as long as the bladder is emptied regularly, you prevent this translocation of bacteria. So when you have a patient who gets this UTI after an augmentation, go into the history very carefully. Ask them what is the frequency, and a simple thing like overnight drainage or frequent catheterization will solve the problem. So be careful. UTI is there. Bacteriuria is found in 80%, but an acute infection about 20% in a year. So you'll get about 1 or 2 episodes in these patients, and you need to warn them. You need to warn them and tell them not to get alarmed, and this is the way to treat it. Now, cancer. How many of us tell our patients that you're likely to get cancer after augmentation? I don't think we do. I don't think we do. But I think it's important. And that is the reason why when you actually contemplate augmentation, depending on the type of bowel segment you use, you must actually discuss this facet. You must discuss this facet with them, and an informed decision must be made that this is what it is. The exact etiology for the development of cancer is not known, but we believe it is a combination of factors. I will just go through that in a minute. But there's a 500-fold increase in the incidence of cancer in patients who've had bowel segments being incorporated. A huge number. But it doesn't happen in a day. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. And therefore, it's advised that any patient who has had some form of ureterosigmoidostomy, etc., bowel segments, you must actually electively endoscope them. You must endoscope them 8 years after the first time after 8 years, and then annually. So if you've had something done, they need colonoscopy. They need colonoscopy, they need cystoscopy. You need to make sure. And if any of these patients after augmentation has hematuria, it must raise a red flag in your brain that you must look for malignancy in that segment, in that bladder, in the segment of bowel, in the bladder where it has been incorporated in the urinary tract. Rule it out. I have seen cancers. I've seen cancers in younger people. I've seen cancers in older people who have had augmentations. And these need to be treated appropriately. There is no doubt that patients who have neurogenic bladders for some reason have a higher incidence of cancer, and that in the remnant bladder that is used. And this is irrespective of the bowel. We don't know why, but it's probably because of infection. You remember that patients who have got neurovesical dysfunction are perennially got bacteriuria. They may have been started on some CIC, or they have some residual urine, they have poor bladder emptying. So there's always infection in them. And we know that infection through the release with bacteria, nitrosamines, etc., causes a problem with actually with malignancy. So there's a constant irritant focus in the bladder all the time, and this again makes it imperative that you advise frequent emptying of the bladder. So this is important to understand that patients who have neurovesical dysfunction have a higher rate. Remember what I told you in the start, that the commonest reason for doing augmentation still is neuropathic bladders. And usually these are done on younger children, and they have a long innings ahead of them. And therefore, the risk is very high. And this is the reason why I would recommend all of you all to read that article written by Snodgrass on why he decries augmentation. He decries augmentation, and he feels that this is one of the worst operations that can be done, and if you can avoid it, avoid it. I have also, over the years, begun to see patients having problems with their bladders, not the operation as such, but the side effects, the long-term side effects of this bowel segment being used. And I am also getting disillusioned with the fact that if you follow up your patients for long periods of time, or if you as a surgeon live long enough to see some of these patients, you will realize that over time, their kidneys begin to give trouble. So therefore, it becomes very important to make sure that when you put knife to skin and augment the bladder, that you have left no stone unturned to make sure that there is no other way of treating these patients. The other thing that I've realized also is that if a bladder is neurologically normal, it just has a reduced capacity, a little bit, but it's a safe bladder. And don't just augment the bladder simply because it is slightly smaller. You'll be surprised as to how these patients, as long as they are continent, are able to void, are able to empty their bladders and retain their original bladders, even though the capacity of that bladder may be 250. They are quite happy. So don't be in a rush to augment them, these young people, because you will have to pay a price for it later on. What are the other effects? Mucus production. You have to tell every patient that mucus will come for the rest of his life. You tell him today, when he's discharged, you tell him, and then when he comes back after 3 months, You tell him again. But when he comes back after 6 months, he will tell you that mucus is coming, because he has forgotten what you told. This is one symptom, one problem which I find patients find it very, very difficult to accept. They forget it. They forget the fact that you told them on numerous occasions that mucus will be part and parcel of their life. I tell them that it's coming in your stool, you can't see it, but here it's coming in the urine, and because you're seeing your urine, you're emptying it, and therefore you have mucus. So there are some theories that over time the villous lining of the small bowel becomes less, and it can actually reduce the amount of mucus production, but it's never zero. It's never zero at all. They have it periodically and it comes every day. So what are the criteria for selection for diversion? I just told you about the fact that you should be very careful when you decide to actually put bowel segments in the urinary tract, that you have to be sure about kidney function. The first criteria I said was, what is the GFR? And there are two absolute contraindications for urinary diversion using bowel segments. One is a low GFR and the other is compromised bowel function. So if you have somebody who's already got short bowel syndrome, irritable bowel disease, inflammatory bowel disease, you would be ill-advised to actually not put their urinary tracts to problems by putting bowel in them. So GFR, to my mind, is the most important, very important. The relative contraindication is prior radiation. And you know that this is all related to pelvic radiation, i.e. pelvic malignancies, be it rectal, be it uterine, etc. CA cervix is a classical example in our country where in the early days they would give them treatment, survival was very good, but then they come to you with bladders which are diseased, bladders which are unsafe, with upper tract changes, and this is relative contraindication. So when they have radiation and you want to augment the bowel, you must be sure that the segment of bowel that you're taking is actually correct. And there's a tendency at this point, because most of the ileum is sitting in the pelvis, that you want to choose a normal one and you by mistake go for jejunum, and then you can be in trouble. So in that situation, you may have to go for transverse colon as an alternative segment for bowel. So absolute contraindications, relative contraindications. Now I'm going to wind up by sharing with you some features about gastrocystoplasty. Now, why have I chosen specifically gastrocystoplasty? Because it's not done very commonly, but it's an operation which everybody believes is a very good operation for patients who've got compromised renal function. And at every meeting, you will find that there will be people who have shown their cases of gastrocystoplasty. There are publications for gastrocystoplasty in literature. And there are people who decry it and there are people who swear by it. But whatever we do, we must remember that we are not looking at an immediate outcome. Any reconstructive procedure is not for immediate. If somebody tells me that, I remember at one of the earliest USI meetings that I attended in Bangalore, when Big Boss HSB was alive, he was sitting in the front row. He always sits in the front row for every meeting I've seen. And one of the senior urologists presented his data on pyeloplasty in children. And the results were to the tune of nearly 98% success. So everybody gave their comments, and and then Big Boss got up and he said, "Dr. So-and-so, you got very good results. But come back after 20 years and tell me your results and the state of the kidney at that time." That was it. There were no more questions asked, no more discussion was held, because these are all reconstructive operations. They have to stand the test of time. And I remember that statement of his so vividly that it still hasn't left my mind. And I believe that that's one of the most important facets of any reconstructive procedure. Who outlives? The patient outlives the surgeon, or the surgeon outlives the patient? That is the important question. So gastrocystoplasty was popularized as an alternative to using any part of the bowel that is distal to, that's the small bowel or the large bowel, saying that, oh, we are talking about reduced GFR, why not use the stomach, because it will secrete all the acid and it will be a good thing. So I said, yes, of course, that's very physiological. So let's look at what's happened to gastrocystoplasty over time. Now, what are the advantages? The biggest advantage of gastric patch compared to ileum or sigmoid is the absence of hyperchloridemia and acidosis by absorption. There is no mucus production in the stomach. There is a little bit, but it's not lithogenic mucus. And there's a reduction of infection because of chronic acidification of the urine, because of the excretion of hydrogen chloride. The risk of infection is less. So these are the advantages claimed by people who believe in gastrocystoplasty. I'm just going to look at two studies which are fairly recent. There's not been much after that in the literature. And in 2014, this was a publication from a large series in Indianapolis, I believe. 50 patients they had on whom they had done gastrocystoplasty for various indications. And they had only 35 patients who met the criteria of what is called primary gastrocystoplasty. That means these were patients who had gastrocystoplasty done at the outset. It's not something that they had one operation, then it was undone, and then the gastrocystoplasty was done. No, these were 35 patients, and this is a large data because this is one of the long, and the follow-up was 19 years. So very long follow-up. Remember, I told you, you have to keep following up these patients. So of the 35 patients, 15 of them had a normal pre-op GFR, 5 had stage 2 CKD, 10 of them had stage 3 CKD, and another 5 had stage 4 CKD. Remember that we said that this operation is very useful in patients who have got abnormal GFR or reduced GFR, and it hopes that it will maintain kidney function or probably improve renal function in some of those patients. That is a general hypothesis. And that is what these people also felt. So out of the 15, 5 out of the 15 patients who had stage 3 and stage 4 CKD improved to normal estimated GFR. Only 5 of them. 1 of them remained in stage 3 disease, but 9 of them progressed to end-stage disease. So these were patients who already had probably reduced GFR, and we hope that by doing this operation, that you will actually prevent the occurrence of renal failure or maintain them. No, it didn't happen, and these patients actually progressed to. So there more than 50% of these patients actually progressed to end-stage renal failure. So if you think that by doing a gastrocystoplasty, you're going to prevent ESRD, you may not. Remember, it's the meat that is important, and the meat is the kidney. If the kidney is bad, whatever you do, it will slowly deteriorate over time. There's another article a little bit more recent in the BJUI, and they looked at children and the long-term results of augmented gastrocystoplasty. AGC is augmented gastrocystoplasty. And they also looked at it long term. And their hypothesis was that primary gastrocystoplasty does not prevent progression to renal failure. And they did this because they felt that there was limited data on long-term outcome of gastrocystoplasty and especially its impact on renal function. So this was their paper published in the BJUI, but not many cases at all. There are 11 cases. But in those 11 cases, majority who had preserved, the outcome was who had preserved or improved renal function after gastrocystoplasty, majority of them. However, in those with renal insufficiency preoperatively, more than half progressed to ESRD post-op, despite this augmented segment of stomach being a safe reservoir. It was done in patients who had neurovesical dysfunction primarily, not for any other indication. So the reservoir was safe. It was a low pressure reservoir, but they still progressed to renal failure in these patients. The small number, only 11 patients they had, but more than half of them actually progressed to renal failure over time. The complications of gastrocystoplasty, hematuria dysuria syndrome is a very distressing symptom. If you have never seen it, it may be, but you don't have to see it to actually recognize it, frankly. If you have a patient who's had an augmented segment with stomach and he will present with hematuria and dysuria, you know that this is the classical syndrome. And this is treated with H2 blockers and or PPIs. But some of them improve. Some of them improve for a while. They come back. You have to keep on giving them the blockers. Some of them require surgical revision because of persistent pain. So you've got to take out this patch. you must, you would have probably realized now that for combined kidney and pancreatic transplants, we are not using the pancreas on the on the bladder. It's now gone back, and they're using the segment into the bowel itself. So there are obviously problems related to pancreas being attached to the bladder to measure the amylase as a level of rejection. That has now been because of problems related to the bladder function and the hematuria dysuria syndrome when this happened. So it's gone back to the old bowel segment. The complications, these were long term again. The long term results were disappointing in terms of malignancy. After 8 years, after 10 years, there's a chance of malignancy. And out of the 11 patients, 4 of them uh, who had a gastric patch after 17 years, malignant transformation occurred in 3 of them. So the author said that the rate was very high, and therefore they have abandoned these procedures in children. They've abandoned it simply because over time they all had, a large majority of them had actually developed cancers. And therefore they said that when the child grows up, there is significant increase in malignant transformation and a high rate of surgical reintervention involving removal of the gastric patch due to various complications and even probably malignancy. So just to brief you that gastrocystoplasty is a good operation. You can easily get it on the gastroepiploic arch. The bladder bladder wall matches the stomach wall. You can get a very good anti-reflux of the ureter into the stomach, but you have to remember that there are consequences as a result of incorporating the stomach in the urinary tract. And therefore, this was one of the first studies to show continued deterioration of renal function in majority of the patients who had preoperative renal insufficiency. So remember, we shy away from doing putting ileum or colon in a patient who's got compromised renal function, and we hope that as a result of putting the stomach in, that we would stall the onset or delay the onset of renal insufficiency, but it doesn't happen over time. And therefore, you may have to make a decision sometimes, albeit hard, to actually put bowel into them for the reasons that the bowel is probably the best substitute. There's no question about it. If you are doing it for patients who have to have a reservoir, there's nothing which beats the bowel. A small volume of bowel, a small length of bowel gives you good volume, a good reservoir for patients who have problems with their voiding. But you have to remember that over time, patients who do have small bowel or even colon are likely to have renal failure over time. So they must be warned. So as far as I am concerned, I firmly believe that the small bowel or the large bowel, whichever, small bowel preferably, is a better option than stomach in the long term. It gives you it helps you greatly to improve bladder dynamics, and it certainly helps in preventing upper tract deterioration, which you want. So if I had a choice in a patient who's got slightly compromised renal function, and I want to actually really put bowel, my choice would actually be small bowel, reduce the capacity of the length of the small bowel, configure it into a low pressure reservoir, and knowing fully well that the long-term consequences of such a thing is going to be renal insufficiency. There are patients where you have to make these tough decisions, and there's no way you can get away from it. And therefore, finally, if you have to do bowel substitution, do not forget, just by doing an operation, you may get a good result initially, but you can't forget the patient. The patient will not forget you because he will come to haunt you. And you will find over time, if you slowly monitor them, if they live long enough, if they have got some comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes, other conditions, you will find that slowly GFR will drop. GFR will drop, and over time, these patients go into renal failure. They may all not land up on dialysis, but if you have a patient who has had this operation done as a child, he could have two things that can happen to him. He can have malignancy develop, and he can have renal failure develop over time. And I have seen this. I have seen this. I have seen malignancy. I have also seen patients go into renal failure, and we've had to transplant them also. So this is something that's very, very important to understand. So bowel substitution is not fit and forget. So if there are any questions, I'll take it from you now. I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Sir, may I ask a question, sir?
Yes, sure.
Sir, what are the investigations we should do in the follow-up of such patients, and how frequently do we need to do them, sir?
Well, first thing to understand is what was the basic reason for which you did the augmentation. Then, so you have your investigations will be related to two facets. One is the basic disease for which the augmentation was done, which requires to be followed up. For example, say if you've done it for neurovesical dysfunction, you've got to look at all that aspect. And the second aspect is the bowel substitution itself. What segment of bowel you use, what is the creatinine, what is the GFR before you started, what is the GFR now, whether there's infection, is it symptomatic, is it asymptomatic, is the patient incontinent, how is the bladder being emptied, what's the frequency of emptying. So all these things have to be checked. You have to check their B12s, you've got to check their calcium, you've got to check their bone. I told you all those things. So in the follow-up, every one of these facets must be looked at. You can't just say, I'm looking at creatinine and be done with it. There are a lot of side effects of bowel, and over time these will happen. This will not happen the first time. So initially you may have to, it takes a while. Say for example, if you're doing an augmentation for a patient with tuberculosis, it may take between 3 to 6 months for that patient to actually get absolutely normal voiding. Not everybody with an augment for TB does CIC, although we tell them, but many of them actually void. So remembering that there's a difference between somebody who's got neurovesical dysfunction and TB. The patient who has TB has a small bladder, but he was voiding. A patient with a neurovesical dysfunction doesn't have a normal bladder, and therefore his voiding is not normal. And therefore, it's likely that a patient who's had augmentation cystoplasty for tuberculosis can actually void. The vast majority of the patients on whom I have done augmentation for TB are actually voiding. Very few of them are on CIC, although we do tell them that. So these are things that you need to, and all the complications and the effects of bowel substitution I told you initially have to be looked at in the follow-up. So as you go, you can see every year you have to check these things as they come. And as they go, as time goes on, 5 years, 10 years, you've got to actually do an endoscopy and make sure there's nothing to look at malignancy. You may find just microscopic hematuria coming in. You may think it's an infection and miss a malignancy. You have to look for imaging and make sure that the upper tracts are stable. So standard imaging that is done.
Sir, one more question, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, what are the fallacies in doing a urine examination over these patients? Because as we know that urine electrolytes are being absorbed again, so how cautious
consider those? No, if you just do an ordinary urine analysis for them, you are likely to find pus cells in the urine. You'll find bacteria in the urine, but they are asymptomatic. All right, they are asymptomatic. You should not find blood. You should not have significant microscopic hematuria, but you are allowed to get 10, 20, 30 WBCs in the urine for these patients. But if they are asymptomatic, you leave them alone. You don't treat. You don't treat asymptomatic bacteria. They can get an infection. So there was recently a study published that you don't have to give these patients long-term low-dose antibiotics. If they are getting problems, then you have to look at it. But just because you have a positive culture, you just need to be aware of it, because when they do get an infection, then this culture becomes significant. So don't treat them on a regular basis with antibiotics and all that stuff.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Sir, one question.
Yes.
Prevent the mucus production.
Sorry?
So what are the measures to decrease the mucus production?
Oh, well, actually the best for mucus is actually urea. Urea is the only one that can dissolve the mucus. But unfortunately, we don't get urea that we can put inside somebody's bladder. We don't get medical grade urea to put inside somebody's bladder and wash it out. So at best, what we do, we just say regular bladder washes, N-acetylcysteine, soda bicarb. All these things are done, and really it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. So the mucus production will carry on. Some days it will be more, some days it will be less. You may find that if the patient is smart, he can tell you that if I've eaten some things, it gets worse, some things it doesn't get worse. So it's all very individualistic. It's not something that we can say, you do this, it will stop. Mucus will be there. The patients, the only thing is the mucus doesn't actually cause a problem with voiding. It doesn't block them. But they need to actually wash it. And this can become an issue in the early days after especially in the immediate post-operative period. You need to have stiff catheters, and your suture lines are going to be tested at this time because mucus can block urine drainage. And once the catheters, etc., are removed, then when they do CIC, I tell them actually to do a little bit of a bladder wash every day. So we teach them to do bladder washes through either the Mitrofanov or through the urethra, and this somehow takes care of it. We also know that the mucus could be a source for recurrent infection. So sometimes you may find that you may have to warn them about it. But there's no way you can reduce it.
Thank you, sir.